Around 95% of its population is Muslim. It is, by proportion, the most Muslim country in Europe. And in 2009, its government banned the headscarf in schools. Not the niqab, not the face veil. The ordinary headscarf worn by ordinary girls in a country where almost everybody is Muslim. Girls were turned away at school gates. One 16-year-old was barred from her classroom in January 2009 and never went back. She sat her final exams from home. 5,000 women marched through the capital in protest. The government did not move. The ban is still in force today, and in 2025 the country's Supreme Court upheld it again. Then, 10 years later, the same government did something that no Western European state was willing to do. In April 2019, under cover of darkness, a chartered plane landed carrying 110 of its own citizens, flown directly out of a Kurdish-run camp in northern Syria. 4 suspected Islamic State fighters, 32 women, 74 children, 9 of them orphans. Britain was at that moment stripping a teenager of her citizenship rather than let her come home. France was arguing about whether to take back children. Kosovo took everybody and then prosecuted them. To understand how the poorest and most Muslim country in Europe ended up with the strictest school rules and the most unflinching repatriation policy on the continent, you have to understand what happened to it in 1999. In the spring of 1999, NATO conducted an 11-week air campaign against Serbian forces over Kosovo. That intervention is the founding fact of the modern Kosovar state, and it produced something you find almost nowhere else on earth: a Muslim-majority society with an intense, uncomplicated affection for the United States. There is a statue of Bill Clinton in Pristina, arm raised in greeting, on a boulevard named after him. There is a George W. Bush Street. When Kosovo declared independence in 2008, its constitution defined the republic as a secular state, neutral in matters of religious belief. That secularism was not imported. Albanian national identity had for a century been built on the idea that religion was secondary to nationhood, a necessary formula for a people split between Muslims, Catholics, and Orthodox. Under Yugoslavia, religious practice was further flattened by decades of communist rule. What emerged was a population that was overwhelmingly Muslim on paper and overwhelmingly relaxed about it in practice. Alcohol in the cafes, headscarves the exception rather than the rule, mosques attended lightly. But 1999 also left a vacuum, and this is the part the founding story leaves out. The war had destroyed housing, infrastructure, and hundreds of religious buildings. The new administration was internationally supervised, underfunded, and overwhelmed. Unemployment ran above 30% nationally and could exceed 50% in rural areas. Into that gap came money. It did not come from Europe. Saudi and Gulf charities arrived with reconstruction funding, and they built. Mosques went up across the country financed with Saudi government money, and the version of Islam they came attached to was not the one Kosovo had practiced. But buildings alone do not change a country. What changed Kosovo was the second thing that arrived with the money: scholarships. Organizations such as the World Assembly of Muslim Youth funded hundreds of places at Islamic institutions in the Middle East. Young Kosovar men left to study and came back as clerics, and the theology they returned with had very little to do with Balkan tradition. This is the mechanism that matters, and it is slower and quieter than anything a raid can catch. A new mosque needs a new imam. A country with a destroyed religious infrastructure needs hundreds of them. And the only people offering to train them for free were the people who had built the mosques. The result is measurable. Of 11 imams arrested in Kosovo across August and September 2014 for preaching extremism and recruiting fighters, 8 were young and had been educated in the Middle East. 8 out of 11. Not a coincidence, and not a conspiracy either. Just what happens when a state cannot staff its own religion and somebody else offers. The head of Kosovo's counterterrorism police described it without euphemism. They promoted political Islam, he said. They spent a great deal of money promoting it through programs aimed mainly at young, vulnerable people, and they brought in a large volume of Wahhabi and Salafi literature. Kosovo's central bank figures suggest Saudi grants later averaged around €100,000 a year, while money from Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates ran at roughly €1,000,000 a year each, often routed through intermediary countries to obscure where it came from and where it was going. One transfer of nearly €500,000 from a Saudi individual was frozen in 2014 because it was destined for a Kosovar teenager. Then Syria happened, and the bill arrived. Between 2012 and 2015, roughly 355 Kosovars traveled to Syria and Iraq, around 256 men, 52 women, and 47 children. The eventual total is usually given as a little over 400. In a country of about 1.8 million people, that works out at roughly 125 fighters per million inhabitants. The highest rate per capita in Europe. Not the highest in the Balkans. The highest on the continent, and it produced figures who became internationally notorious. Lavdrim Muhaxheri commanded the Islamic State's ethnic Albanian brigade and ran its Albanian language propaganda operation. Before that, he had worked for KFOR, the NATO-led peacekeeping force in Kosovo. Read that again. A man employed by the Western intervention that created his country appeared in a 2014 video beheading a young man in Iraq. Interpol issued a red notice for him. The U.S. Secretary of State named him a threat to American national security. He was killed in an airstrike in Syria in 2017. Nearly half of those who left did so before the Islamic State declared its caliphate in June 2014, initially joining groups fighting to overthrow Assad. Most of those who stayed later transitioned to the Islamic State, and those who traveled afterwards mostly joined it directly, helped by a stream of jihadist propaganda translated into Albanian. Around 70 Kosovars died out there. So a country built by a Western intervention, full of streets named after American presidents, was exporting jihadists at a higher rate than any other nation on the continent. Kosovo's response was not gradual. Here is the mechanism, and its speed is the point. On August 11, 2014, police arrested 40 men in a single operation, seizing explosives, weapons, and ammunition on suspicion of acting against the constitutional order. Weeks later, a second operation arrested 15 people, at least 9 of them imams, including an influential cleric from the Grand Mosque in Pristina. Officers wore masks to protect their identities from reprisals. In March 2015, at the request of the United States, Parliament passed a foreign fighters law criminalizing travel abroad to participate in a foreign conflict, with a maximum sentence of 15 years. By May 2016, the cumulative figures were these: 67 people charged, 14 imams arrested, and 19 Muslim organizations shut down for acting against the Constitution, inciting hatred and recruiting for terrorism. Zekarija Kazemi, one of the most prominent radical clerics and the ideological mentor of Muhaxheri himself, was convicted of recruiting for the Islamic State and jailed for 10 years. In November 2016, authorities disrupted a plot coordinated by Muhaxheri from Syria, arresting 19 people in Kosovo and 6 more in Albania and North Macedonia. 25 arrests, one of the largest terrorism operations in Europe that year. Reported targets included state institutions, Serbian Orthodox sites, and an Israeli football team playing in the region. And note one detail that is usually left out, because it establishes what this was and was not. In 2016, Kosovo also shut down a network of 5 Shia organizations run by an Iranian cleric, who was charged with money laundering and terrorist financing. Sunni networks and Shia networks. Gulf funding and Iranian funding. This was not a campaign against one strand of Islam by a rival strand, and it was not a campaign against Islam. It was a state removing every foreign-funded religious structure it judged to be operating against its own constitutional order, from whichever direction the money came. The foreign minister of the time put the government's position in a single sentence in a letter to an American newspaper. Kosovo, he wrote, would not be held hostage by a small group of violent religious extremists whose absolutist interpretation of Islam was overwhelmingly at odds with the country's secular tradition. Note the framing. Not at odds with Kosovo's law, at odds with Kosovo's Islam. By 2016, according to government statistics, the flow had effectively stopped. No new departures were recorded that year. If you want more of the stories where the smallest country makes the hardest decision, subscribe to Fall of Nations. Because in 2019, Kosovo did something that Britain, France, and Germany all refused to do, and it is still the reason security officials across Europe cite Kosovo by name. By early 2019, the Islamic State's territory had collapsed, and thousands of foreign fighters and their families sat in Kurdish-run camps in northern Syria. Every Western government faced the same question. Most gave the same answer, which was some version of "not our problem." Britain revoked citizenship rather than allow returns. France agreed only to consider children, case by case, and slowly. Germany resisted. The general European position, stated more politely than this, was that these people had forfeited any claim on the countries that issued their passports. There was a legal argument for it, and there was a political one, and the political one was doing most of the work, because no interior minister wants to explain to a newspaper why a returned Islamic State member is living 3 streets away. Kosovo took the opposite view and acted on it in a single night. In the early hours of April 20, 2019, a chartered aircraft landed at Pristina Airport carrying 110 citizens brought out of the Al-Hol camp with American logistical support. 4 men suspected of fighting for the Islamic State, 32 women, 74 children, 9 of whom had lost their parents in the war. Counter-terrorism police secured the airport. Relatives had not been told it was happening. The 4 men were arrested on the tarmac. The Justice Minister, Abelard Tahiri, framed it in terms that were both moral and blunt. Kosovo would not stop until every citizen was brought home. Anyone who had committed a crime would face justice, and the government could not allow its citizens to remain a threat to the West and to Kosovo's allies. The American embassy called it an example for the entire coalition to follow. It was the first repatriation on that scale by any country in Europe. Then came the part that matters more than the flight, because repatriation without prosecution is just relocation. 3 of the 4 men were convicted, receiving sentences from 6 months to 5.5 years. All 32 women were placed under investigation on arrival, and many were put under house arrest within days. By late 2020, a Kosovar court had sentenced 27 of the 32, mostly suspended sentences of 2 to 3 years with mandatory psychological treatment. The children were treated as victims rather than suspects, which sounds obvious, and was not obvious anywhere else in Europe at the time. A second repatriation followed in July 2021, bringing back 11 more, including 6 male fighters, who were charged with terrorism offenses. Prosecutors had by then charged well over 100 people with joining extremist groups abroad. By November 2020, 2/3 of all adults repatriated to the Western Balkans had been investigated, tried, and convicted of terrorism offenses, and Kosovo accounted for most of them. Set that against what the same countries lecturing Kosovo were doing. Britain was fighting in its own courts to keep a teenager out. France was repatriating children in batches of dozens over several years. Kosovo, with under 2 million people, a GDP smaller than a mid-sized European city, and no seat at the United Nations, brought back 110 in one night and convicted 30 of them. Now hold the other side, because there are 2 serious objections, and both deserve stating properly. The first is about the crackdown's substance. The United States' own country, reports on terrorism criticized Kosovo for short sentencing on terrorism offenses. They noted there were no tailored interventions in Kosovo prisons for radicalized inmates, no cognitive behavioral therapy, no structured mentoring, and no mechanism to monitor terrorism convicts after release. Kosovo's de-radicalization programming was largely donor-driven, meaning it existed because foreign governments funded it rather than because Kosovo could sustain it. A country still recovering from a war with serious corruption and rule of law problems was being asked to run a rehabilitation system more sophisticated than anything Germany or Britain had built, with vastly greater resources. And there is the obvious question about motive. Kosovo has spent its entire existence seeking recognition, NATO membership, and a path into the European Union. A state in that position has powerful incentives to be seen doing the right thing loudly. Whether the repatriation was principle or performance is not answerable from outside, and both can be true simultaneously. The second objection is sharper, and it concerns the headscarf. Note what the ban actually is. It is not a law passed by Parliament. It is an administrative instruction issued by the Education Ministry in 2009 and 2010 and reissued in 2014, prohibiting religious uniforms in primary and secondary schools. A ministerial document, not a vote. And Parliament was asked. In August 2011, the Assembly considered two constitutional amendments, one that would have prohibited discrimination against Muslims in schools and was understood as accommodating headscarves, and one that would have introduced religious education. The first failed by 43 votes to 39. The second was rejected by 64 to 18. Even the Prime Minister's own deputies voted against, in a parliament representing a country that is 95% Muslim. So a rule affecting the daily life of a religious majority rests on a ministerial instruction, whose key article, according to Kosovo's own legal analysts, contains general prohibitions that are not specifically defined, creating a clear risk of selective enforcement. The Islamic community of Kosovo has argued for 15 years that a headscarf is not a uniform in any meaningful sense, since it has no prescribed model, color, or material identifying an organization. That is not a theological argument. It is a straightforward point about what the instruction says, and the human cost is documented. The 16-year-old barred in January 2009 was allowed to sit her final exams in her headscarf, but never permitted back into the building. She studied at home while the case went through the courts. In October 2024, an 18-year-old was removed from a school in Peja, allegedly verbally and without any written notice, prompting an ombudsman investigation and a prosecutor's inquiry into whether her rights had been violated. A women's professional network told the courts it had received numerous complaints over 4 years from girls expelled or suspended over headscarves. In 2025, the Supreme Court rejected the challenge and upheld the ban. And there is the question nobody in Pristina enjoys answering. The deputy foreign minister once explained the policy by saying the scarf is not an element of Kosovar identity, that it signifies the submission of women to men rather than choice, and that a 16 or 17-year-old cannot make such a decision consciously. Whatever you think of that argument, it is an argument about what the majority religion of a country is permitted to look like, made by the state, about its own citizens, and enforced by keeping girls out of classrooms. Kosovo's constitutional court has hinted it would likely find headscarves in public schools unconstitutional under the secularism clause, citing European Court of Human Rights precedent from France, which means a Muslim-majority country is applying French laïcité reasoning to Muslim schoolgirls using case law developed in a Catholic heritage republic. Set Kosovo against the rest of this series, and the comparisons are genuinely disorientating. Britain reviewed the Muslim Brotherhood for a year and produced a visa policy and refused to repatriate its own nationals. Austria launched the largest police operation in its post-war history and lost in its own courts. The Netherlands ran covert surveillance of mosques through private contractors and was fined. Switzerland put a prohibition in its constitution by referendum. Italy simply never signed the agreement. Jordan banned a movement outright and is now arguing about a party's name. Kosovo did something none of them did. It prosecuted the recruiters rather than the community, shut down the foreign-funded structures on both sides of the Sunni-Shia divide, brought its own citizens back from a war zone and put them through its courts. And it did all of this as the poorest country in Europe, with a population of under 2 million, 5 years after the last of its people had left for Syria. The flow of fighters, by official accounts, stopped almost entirely. And yet, the country that did all of that is still not a member of the European Union, is still not in NATO, and is still not recognized by 5 EU member states. Kosovar citizens only gained visa-free travel to the Schengen area in January 2024, the last people in the Western Balkans to get it. For 15 years, ordinary Kosovars needed a visa to visit the continent whose military alliance had created their country. A Muslim-majority state that built a secular constitution, banned the headscarf in its schools, jailed its extremist clerics, and flew its own Islamic State families home to face trial has spent 17 years being told to wait. Which is the uncomfortable thing this case exposes, and it is not really about Kosovo. Europe spends a great deal of energy asking whether a Muslim-majority society can produce a functioning secular democracy that takes political Islam seriously. One did it on Europe's own continent, largely to European specifications, at enormous cost, with almost no resources. And Europe has still not decided what to do about it. There is a harder version of that observation too, and it cuts against the flattering reading of the whole story. If a country believes its acceptance depends on demonstrating secular credentials to a skeptical continent, the incentive is not to get the policy right. The incentive is to get it visible. Repatriating 110 citizens is genuinely hard, genuinely responsible, and genuinely rare. Keeping an 18-year-old out of a classroom over a headscarf costs the state nothing and demonstrates the same thing to the same audience. A government under permanent audit will eventually be tempted to reach for whichever proves the point more cheaply. Kosovo has done both, and only one of them was necessary. So, we want to hear from you. Is Kosovo the model, a Muslim-majority country that proved a secular state can dismantle extremist networks and take responsibility for its own citizens without pretending the problem belongs to somebody else? Or does the headscarf ban expose the flaw in it, a government using a ministerial instruction to keep its own girls out of school, applying French secularism to a country where almost everybody is Muslim, and doing it partly to look acceptable to a Europe that still will not let it in? Tell us in the comments, we read them. And if you want the stories underneath the headlines, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because dozens of Kosovar citizens are still in camps in Syria, and Pristina has said it intends to bring every one of them home.